My name is Cassidy, 33 years old, and for my entire adult life, I was the financial safety net for a family that despised me. As a senior financial strategy consultant in Manhattan, I was trained to spot bad investments. Yet it took me until this freezing Thanksgiving night to realize my parents were the worst investment of all. I arrived late to our Greenwich, Connecticut family estate because of a brutal snowstorm. Instead of walking through the front door, I approached the glass patio doors. Standing unseen in the bitter cold, I looked into the warmly lit dining room. My mother Beatrice was raising a crystal flute of champagne to a table full of wealthy neighbors. Thank God Cassidy did not show up. She laughed, her diamond necklace catching the light. She always ruins the aesthetic of my dinners. My younger sister Melanie smirked and took a sip of her wine. Do not worry, Mom, she is just a walking ATM anyway. We only need her card, not her company. I did not cry. I did not feel sad. I felt absolute cold clarity. I pulled out my phone and dialed my lawyer, Miles. Bring the sheriff, I said into the receiver. We are shutting this party down in 20 minutes. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to cut off toxic family members who used you for your money. I kept my phone gripped tightly in my gloved hand as the snow continued to fall around me. The wind whipped through the pine trees of the sprawling property, but I barely felt the chill. The heat of my own quiet rage kept me warm. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, I watched the people who shared my blood acting as if they owned the world. The extravagant roast turkey resting on a silver platter, the imported floral centerpieces, the expensive bottles of red wine being poured freely by my father Gordon. None of them knew that I was standing just a few feet away, holding the legal documents that would strip them of everything. Growing up in this affluent colonial estate, I learned very quickly that love was transactional. Beatrice and Gordon only valued what looked good to their country club friends. Melanie was the golden child. She was beautiful, charming, and perfectly molded to be a wealthy socialite. I was the serious one, the numbers girl, the one who worked 80-hour weeks on Wall Street to build a career from nothing. They called me heartless and obsessed with money. Yet whenever their reckless spending caught up with them, I was the first person they called. Through the glass, I saw Melanie lean her head onto the shoulder of her husband Jordan. Jordan was a brilliant African-American real estate attorney who loved the luxury lifestyle just as much as my sister did. They were the picture-perfect power couple. But I knew the ugly truth hiding behind their designer clothes. I knew about the maxed-out credit cards and the secret loans. For the last 3 years, I had quietly paid Gordon's medical bills and covered the massive debts Melanie accrued trying to become an internet personality. I bled myself dry to keep the walls of this massive house from caving in on them. And exactly how did they repay me? By stealing from me and plotting behind my back. I watched Jordan laugh at a joke my father made, completely unaware that I had spent the last month investigating his fraudulent activities. They thought my absence tonight was a victory. They thought they had finally succeeded in pushing me out of the family picture while keeping my wallet wide open. I checked my watch. 18 minutes left until Miles and the authorities arrived. The snow was beginning to accumulate on my expensive wool coat, but I refused to retreat to my car. I wanted to burn this image into my memory. I wanted to remember exactly how happy they looked while mocking the person who kept a roof over their heads. My mother clinked her glass against the glass of a wealthy neighbor, flashing her perfect porcelain smile. It was a flawless performance of high society grace. My fingers lightly brushed against the thick envelope inside my heavy coat. The documents inside were heavy with undeniable proof. Proof of unpaid mortgages. Proof of forged signatures. Proof I was no longer their ATM but their creditor. Funding their delusions was over. I took a deep breath of the freezing winter air to steady my rapidly racing heart. I slowly reached out, grabbed the freezing cold brass handle of the glass patio door, and prepared to step inside. But I did not pull the handle right away. I let my hand drop and unlocked my phone one last time. My thumb hovered over a secured folder labeled Apex Holdings. Inside were dozens of scanned documents, wire transfers, and overdue notices. I needed to look at them. I needed to remind myself exactly why I was doing this. I needed to extinguish any lingering trace of daughterly guilt before I walked into that room. I opened the first file. It was a wire transfer confirmation for $60,000 from 2 years ago. Looking at the numbers, I could hear my father Gordon pacing in my Manhattan apartment. "Cassidy, you have to help me," he had begged, refusing to meet my eyes. "The hospital bills are piling up and the insurance company denied the claim. If you do not wire the funds by Friday, they are going to place a lien on the house. Your mother will be destroyed if her friends find out we are struggling." I had wired the money that same afternoon without asking questions. I later discovered the hospital bill was only $12,000. The rest of my hard-earned money went to covering his reckless stock losses. He had looked his own daughter in the eye and weaponized his health to steal from me. I swiped to the next file. It was a credit card statement under my name, maxed out at $45,000. The bitter memory of my sister Melanie screaming through the phone echoed in my mind. "You do not understand how the industry works, Cassidy," she had shrieked from a hotel suite in Paris. "My brand deals are falling through. I need this trip to save my career. You make a fortune playing with spreadsheets. Do not be so selfish. Stop suffocating my potential and just pay the balance." I paid it because Beatrice called me crying the next morning, accusing me of sabotaging my sister out of jealousy. I paid the bill just to buy a few months of peace. But peace was never the goal for them. Their goal was parasitism. They wanted my resources while erasing my presence from their lives. I kept swiping through the digital records, legal notices, default warnings, forged signatures. Thousands of dollars bled from my bank accounts to fund their masquerade. Every single document was a testament to their greed and my former foolishness. But the final document in the folder was different. It was the trap. It was the legal acquisition of their debt, signed and certified by the state. My phone suddenly vibrated in my palm, pulling me back to the freezing present. It was an encrypted message from Miles, my corporate attorney. "The judge signed the emergency order this afternoon," the message read on my screen. "Law enforcement is briefed and en route to the estate. We have a green light to proceed." I quickly typed back a single sentence. "I am going in now." Miles replied instantly. "Exactly 20 minutes until the sheriff arrives here. Keep them talking. Let them dig their own graves tonight." I locked my phone and slipped it deep into my winter coat pocket. The countdown had begun. 20 minutes. That was all the time they had left to play pretend. I finally pushed down the brass handle of the patio door and stepped inside the dim mudroom. The warm scent of roasted turkey and cedar wood washed over me. I unbuttoned my coat, shaking the snow from my shoulders. I could hear the muffled sounds of arrogant laughter and clinking silverware echoing down the hallway. They were celebrating their cleverness, celebrating my absence. I walked methodically down the corridor, my heels clicking against the marble floors. With every single step, I shed the identity of the financially abused daughter. I was no longer the family ATM. I was the CEO of Apex Holdings, and I was here to collect everything. I reached the heavy oak doors separating the hallway from the dining room. I could hear Jordan making a toast, his voice booming with confidence. "To our family," he said, and the room erupted in agreement. I placed both hands flat against the polished wood of the double doors. I took one final deep breath, feeling certainty settling in my chest. Then I pushed the heavy oak doors open with enough force to make the brass hinges groan. I stepped right into the middle of the dining room. The laughter died instantly. Mid-sentence, conversations choked off. Silver forks froze halfway to open mouths. The cheerful clinking of expensive crystal glasses stopped abruptly. Every eye in the opulent room locked onto me. The silence that fell over the Thanksgiving table was absolute. Nobody moved, and the only sound was the crackling of the logs in the fireplace. My mother Beatrice was the first to recover her composure. She treated social awkwardness like a stain on a white rug, rushing to scrub it away. She forced a bright plastic smile onto her face and stood up, her silk dress rustling in the quiet room. "Cassidy, darling?" she chirped, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "We thought the snowstorm had completely trapped you in the city. What a delightful surprise. You are just in time for the main course." Her eyes, however, were cold and completely devoid of warmth. They darted nervously toward the wealthy neighbors sitting across from her, silently begging them to ignore the tension. I did not say a word. I just stood there, letting the heavy silence stretch out to an uncomfortable length, watching her squirm. My younger sister Melanie scoffed, breaking the tension with her usual brand of cruelty. She tossed her perfectly styled hair over her shoulder and gestured toward the far corner of the dining room with her manicured hand. "You completely missed the seating chart, Cass," she said, rolling her eyes. "The table is entirely full. You will have to sit at the children's table in the corner." A few of the guests chuckled nervously, staring down at their expensive china plates. The children's table was a tiny, wobbly folding table squeezed next to the kitchen door. It was a deliberate, calculated insult meant to put me in my place. It was meant to remind me that despite my career and my wealth in this house, I was nothing more than an afterthought, a burden they tolerated only when necessary. Gordon cleared his throat, but said nothing, staring blankly at his wine glass. Years ago, a comment like that would have made me turn around and leave in tears. 5 years ago, I would have started a screaming match, ruining the holiday and giving them the crazy daughter narrative they desperately craved. But tonight, I felt absolutely nothing but a cold surgical precision. I completely ignored Melanie. I did not even look at her. Instead, I draped my coat over a spare wooden chair by the entrance and walked with deliberate steps straight toward the head of the dining table. My father instinctively leaned back as I approached. I reached out, picked up a heavy crystal decanter filled with expensive Bordeaux, and poured myself a generous glass. The dark red liquid splashed heavily against the crystal. I took a slow sip, letting my eyes sweep over the terrified faces of my family members. They were waiting for an explosion, but my absolute calm terrified them even more. I walked slowly around the perimeter of the table, letting my hand graze the backs of the heavy mahogany chairs. I finally stopped right behind where Melanie and her husband Jordan were seated. Jordan shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His broad shoulders were tense, his charismatic lawyer smile completely gone. He refused to look up at me, focusing entirely on the slice of roasted turkey on his plate. I leaned in slightly, invading his personal space, just enough to make him rigid. "Jordan," I said softly, my voice barely above a whisper, but clear enough for the entire room to hear. "You have been awfully quiet tonight. Usually you are the one leading the toasts and celebrating family values." Jordan swallowed hard, the muscles in his jaw ticking. He turned his head to look up at me, trying to muster a confident glare. "We are just trying to enjoy a peaceful dinner, Cassidy," he replied, his voice tight. As Jordan shifted his weight and rested his arm on the white tablecloth, the cuff of his expensive suit jacket pulled back slightly. The warm light from the crystal chandelier caught something metallic, sending a sharp gleam directly into my eyes. My gaze dropped instantly to his left wrist. Time seemed to slow down. Fastened securely around his wrist was a vintage silver and gold Cartier tank watch. It was not just any luxury timepiece. It had a very distinct tiny scratch right near the Roman numeral 4. I knew that scratch intimately because I was the one who accidentally caused it against a granite countertop 2 years ago. It was my $12,000 Cartier watch, the exact same watch I had reported stolen from my locked Manhattan apartment a month ago, shortly after Jordan and Melanie had stayed there for a weekend trip. A fresh wave of adrenaline hit my bloodstream, sharp and cold. He had not just forged financial documents and lied to banks. He had actually walked into my sanctuary and stolen from my bedroom. I smiled. "That is a truly stunning timepiece, Jordan," I said, keeping my voice light and conversational. I leaned back slightly, crossing my arms over my chest. "The silver and gold contrast really suits your complexion. It looks remarkably like a vintage piece." Jordan puffed out his chest, completely misreading the situation. He thought I was trying to make peace, trying to flatter my way back into their good graces after my dramatic entrance. He shot a smug look at my sister Melanie before turning back to me with a wide, bright smile. "Thank you, Cassidy," he said smoothly, adjusting his tailored suit jacket sleeve so the watch was even more visible to the rest of the table. I have to say I have always had a very sharp eye for classic luxury, but I cannot take full credit for this one. Gordon actually gave it to me as an early Christmas gift. He said a successful real estate lawyer needs a watch that commands absolute respect in the boardroom. I shifted my gaze down the length of the long dining table to my father. Gordon was suddenly intensely interested in his serving of mashed potatoes. The color had completely drained from his face, leaving his skin a pale, sickly gray under the glow of the chandelier. His hands were trembling slightly as he gripped his heavy silver fork. He tried to swallow, but it looked like he was choking on nothing. "Well," I said, my voice easily cutting through the thick, uncomfortable tension in the room. "That is incredibly generous of you, Dad, especially considering the current dismal state of your retirement portfolio and those credit card bills you begged me to pay off last spring." Gordon stammered, dropping his fork onto his fine porcelain plate with a loud, sharp clatter that made the woman next to him flinch. "Now, Cassidy, let us not talk about family finances at the dinner table," he mumbled, refusing to lift his head and meet my eyes. "It was just a small token of my deep appreciation for everything Jordan does for this family. He handles a lot of our affairs. We should really be focusing on the holiday spirit and being grateful for what we have." I took another slow, deliberate sip of my red wine, savoring the rich taste as I watched him squirm. "A small token," I repeated, letting the words hang heavily in the quiet air. "That is fascinating, because that small token is a vintage Cartier tank, and it just so happens to look exactly like the one I kept in the locked velvet display case on my bedroom dresser. The exact same dresser in the Manhattan apartment that you and Melanie stayed in last month, Jordan." Jordan let out a loud, condescending chuckle, shaking his head as if I were a hysterical child throwing a tantrum over a toy. "Come on, Cass," he said, his tone dripping with patronizing patience. "Do not be dramatic. There are thousands of vintage Cartier watches floating around the world. You cannot seriously be suggesting what I think you are suggesting. We are family. You are embarrassing yourself in front of our esteemed guests." I smiled again, this time showing teeth. "You are right, Jordan. There are thousands of them. But there is only one with a microscopic scratch right next to the Roman numeral 4, caused by a very clumsy collision with a granite countertop 2 years ago." I stared dead into his eyes, watching the arrogant lawyer facade finally begin to crack. "And more importantly, there is only one with the specific serial number that I provided to the New York Police Department when I filed a grand larceny report 3 weeks ago. I already gave the detectives the security footage from my building lobby, showing you carrying a rather suspiciously heavy duffel bag out of my apartment on Sunday morning. I imagine the authorities will be very interested to know the stolen property has miraculously appeared across state lines, strapped directly to your wrist." A collective gasp rippled through the dining room. The wealthy neighbors sitting adjacent to Jordan suddenly leaned away from him, pulling their chairs back slightly, as if his expensive suit was contagious. The woman sitting to my right, a prominent local socialite, nervously dabbed her mouth with a linen napkin and glanced anxiously toward the front door. The festive Thanksgiving atmosphere evaporated completely, replaced by the suffocating reality of a felony accusation. Jordan opened his mouth to defend himself, his face flushing a deep, angry red, but no words came out. He looked desperately at my sister, but Melanie was staring at his wrist in pure horror. Before Jordan could stammer out a legal defense, the sharp, piercing sound of a silver spoon striking a crystal champagne flute rang out across the room. My mother, Beatrice, was standing at the head of the table, her knuckles stark white as she gripped the glass. She struck it again, aggressively demanding attention. "Enough of this absolute nonsense!" Beatrice snapped, her voice trembling with forced cheerfulness. "We will not have this lovely evening ruined by petty accusations and wild misunderstandings. I have wonderful family news to share. News that truly matters and will eclipse all of this ridiculous negativity. It is time to celebrate our real blessings." Beatrice took a deep, shuddering breath, smoothing down the front of her silk dress, as if she could physically iron out the tension in the room. She forced her gaze away from the stolen watch on Jordan's wrist and beamed at the remaining guests. "Gordon and I have been waiting for the perfect moment to share this," she announced. Her voice pitched unnaturally high to mask her panic. "As you all know, family is the most important thing to us, and our family is expanding. Melanie and Jordan are expecting their first child next spring." A collective murmur of polite congratulations rippled through the dining room. A few of the wealthy neighbors clapped politely, clearly relieved to have a socially acceptable reason to look away from the felony accusation hanging in the air. Melanie placed a manicured hand over her perfectly flat stomach and produced a flawless, trembling sigh. Tears of joy pooled in her bright blue eyes right on cue. "Thank you, everyone," Melanie gushed, leaning into Jordan's side. "We are just so incredibly blessed. It has been a stressful year, but this baby is our miracle." Beatrice clapped her hands together, determined to steer the narrative back to her golden child. "And because we want our grandchild to grow up with the same wonderful memories and privileges that our daughters had, Gordon and I have made a very important decision. We are officially stepping down as the masters of this beautiful Greenwich estate. We have legally gifted this entire house, the grounds, and the property title to Melanie and Jordan. It is our legacy to them." The room erupted into genuine gasps this time. Gifting a multi-million-dollar property in Fairfield County was no small gesture. It was a massive transfer of generational wealth. Gordon finally looked up from his plate, a strained smile plastered on his pale face. "We just want to make sure the house stays in the hands of the people who truly appreciate family values," he added, shooting a pointed glare in my direction. I stood perfectly still at the head of the table, my glass of Bordeaux still resting in my hand. I let the absolute absurdity of the situation wash over me. They were giving away a house they could not even afford to heat, a house I had been secretly bankrolling for 3 long years, to the sister who despised me and the brother-in-law who robbed me. It was a masterclass in financial delusion. They were trading a massive liability, masquerading as an asset. Melanie wiped a single calculated tear from her cheek and turned her gaze toward me. The vulnerability vanished from her eyes, instantly replaced by a cold, victorious smirk. She had won the ultimate prize, and she wanted to make sure I felt the agonizing sting of defeat. "Do not worry, Cassidy," Melanie said, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "We know you love coming up here to escape the noisy city. Jordan actually drafted a guest lease for you this morning. We are going to renovate the main house for the baby, but you can always rent the pool house from us during the summer holidays. We will even give you a family discount on the monthly rate." The sheer audacity of her offer was almost poetic. She was offering to rent me a tiny shack on the exact same property I had kept out of foreclosure with my own hard-earned salary. A few of the guests shifted uncomfortably in their heavy mahogany chairs, recognizing the blatant cruelty masked as sisterly generosity. I did not blink. I did not frown. I simply took a slow, deliberate sip of my red wine, tasting the rich oak and dark fruit notes as they coated my tongue. "That is very thoughtful of you, Melanie," I replied evenly. "A guest lease. How incredibly generous." Jordan, emboldened by my remarkably calm response and desperate to regain his professional footing after the watch incident, puffed out his chest and adjusted his silk collar. He gave the table a confident, arrogant nod. "Well, as a real estate attorney, I know how messy these family transfers can get if they are not handled correctly," Jordan bragged, his smooth courtroom voice returning in full force. "I personally drafted the deed transfer and handled all the complicated title paperwork myself. I wanted to make sure everything was absolutely ironclad. No loopholes, no prolonged probate issues. The property is legally and permanently registered under our names as of yesterday afternoon, free and clear." I lowered my wine glass, the crystal catching the bright light of the overhead chandelier. I looked at Jordan, then at Melanie, and finally at my parents, who were clinging to this hollow illusion of wealth like drowning passengers on a sinking ship. I let a slow, genuine smile spread across my face. "Ironclad," I repeated softly, nodding my head. "You handled the title transfer yourself. That is brilliant, Jordan, truly brilliant work." I took a step closer to him, resting my free hand lightly against the edge of the heavy mahogany table. "Tell me something, Jordan," I said, tilting my head slightly, as if asking a genuine professional question. "When you drafted this ironclad deed, did you just pull a standard municipal county search, or did you run a full comprehensive financial audit for secondary encumbrances?" Jordan rolled his eyes, letting out a loud theatrical sigh that was meant to show the rest of the table how tiresome he found me. He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest in a defensive posture. "Stick to your corporate spreadsheets, Cassidy." He sneered, his voice dripping with condescension. "I am a licensed real estate attorney in the state of Connecticut. I know exactly what I am doing. I personally ran the title company checks myself last week. The property is completely free and clear. There are no mechanic liens, no unpaid property taxes, and absolutely no encumbrances on the deed. It is a pristine title. You cannot outsmart me in my own professional field, so I suggest you stop trying to ruin your sister's special night." I let him finish his arrogant little speech. I let the absolute certainty of his words echo in the silent dining room. The wealthy neighbors exchanged relieved glances, trusting the confident lawyer over the estranged daughter. Melanie smirked, taking another sip of her wine, completely satisfied that her husband had put me in my place. "That is a very thorough explanation, Jordan," I replied, keeping my voice dangerously calm. "It is a shame your client lied to you." I slowly turned my gaze away from Jordan and looked directly down the length of the table at my father. Gordon was sitting as still as a statue. The nervous energy he had displayed earlier was completely gone, replaced by a rigid, terrified paralysis. He was staring at his plate, refusing to look up, his breathing shallow and rapid. "Did you tell him, Dad?" I asked, my voice slicing through the heavy silence of the room. "Did you tell your brilliant, highly educated son-in-law about the secondary mortgage you took out 3 years ago?" The smirk instantly vanished from Melanie's face. Jordan uncrossed his arms, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. He looked at my father, waiting for a quick denial, but Gordon remained completely silent. I took another step down the table, closing the distance between myself and the head of the family. "I am talking about the $500,000 commercial loan you secured directly against the equity of this very estate." I continued, making sure every single guest heard every single word. "The loan you desperately needed to fund Melanie's luxury activewear boutique. You remember that little business venture, do you not, Melanie? The boutique that miraculously went completely bankrupt after only 6 months because you spent the entire operating budget chartering private jets to Milan and hiring celebrity photographers for your social media feed." Melanie's mouth fell open in shock. She looked wildly around the room, her carefully constructed victim persona shattering into a million pieces. "Mom," she gasped, looking to Beatrice for help. "Tell her to stop making things up." But Beatrice was staring at her husband in absolute horror. "Gordon," she whispered, her voice trembling with genuine fear. "Gordon, what is she talking about? You told me that money came from a private investor. You promised me you never touched the equity of the house." Gordon finally looked up, his face a sickening shade of pale gray. Sweat was beading on his forehead despite the cool draft coming from the hallway. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a dry, rattling gasp came out. Jordan stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. He slammed his hands down on the table, leaning toward my father. "Gordon, look at me," Jordan demanded, his smooth lawyer voice replaced by a sharp, panicked bark. "Is there an unrecorded secondary mortgage on this property? Did you sign away the equity of this house without disclosing it to me before I filed the transfer deed?" Gordon squeezed his eyes shut and buried his face in his hands, letting out a pathetic, muffled sob. The absolute confirmation of his guilt hit the room like a physical shockwave. Jordan stumbled back slightly, his legal mind racing to calculate the catastrophic damage he had just inflicted upon himself. If the house carried a massive hidden debt, he had not just accepted a free mansion. By legally rushing the title transfer into his and Melanie's names, he had just personally assumed a massive, crippling financial liability. His arrogance had blinded him to the most basic rule of his own profession. "But the secondary mortgage is not even the best part of the story," I said, raising my wine glass slightly as if proposing a toast. I took a slow, deliberate sip, letting the suspense suffocate them. You see, Jordan, a secondary mortgage only becomes a critical legal issue when the borrower stops making the monthly payments. And my father defaulted on that $500,000 loan exactly 8 months ago. The bank officially called the debt. Jordan's eyes widened in absolute terror. He stared at me, the blood draining completely from his face as the trap finally snapped shut around him. Jordan's silence was deafening, but Melanie could not read the room. She stood up, her chair screeching against the floor, her hands balled into tight fists. She glared at me, her chest heaving with theatrical outrage. "Why are you doing this, Cassidy?" she screamed, abandoning her sweet, innocent, expectant mother persona. "Why do you always ruin everything for me? This is my house now. Mom and Dad gave it to me because I actually care about them. You are jealous because you sit alone in a sterile apartment with your spreadsheets while I build a real family. You come in here making up vicious lies about mortgages and stolen watches just to purposely destroy my special night. Get out of my new house right now," she yelled. I kept my eyes locked on Jordan, watching his legal mind scramble for a lifeline. He slowly straightened his posture, clearing his throat and adjusting his silk tie in a desperate bid to regain his lost authority. He placed a hand on Melanie's arm, urging her to sit back down. "It is fine," Mel Jordan said, his voice shaky at first, but gaining volume as he spoke. "Let her spin her little tales. Even if Gordon did take out a loan and default on it, that is a matter between him and the bank. I know exactly how Fairfield County courts work. A bank foreclosure takes years. They have to file notices, grant grace periods, and schedule rounds of mediation. As the new legal owner of the deed, I will simply file an injunction tomorrow morning. I can tie a massive corporate bank up in litigation for half a decade before they even get close to an eviction. We are perfectly safe." It was almost beautiful to watch him cling to his textbook legal theories. He was relying on the slow, bureaucratic gears of traditional banking to save him from his own stupidity. The wealthy neighbors at the table began whispering among themselves, some nodding in agreement with Jordan. They understood the system perfectly well. They knew rich people with good lawyers rarely faced immediate consequences. Beatrice let out a long, shuddering sigh of profound relief, reaching for her wine glass with trembling fingers. Gordon, however, remained completely silent, his head still buried in his hands, unable to look his friends in the eye. He knew the truth was far worse than what Jordan was confidently predicting. He knew because he had been receiving the final certified warning letters for months, even if he had been too terrified to actually open them and read the contents. I placed my wineglass down on the table with a soft, definitive clink. "That is a very solid strategy, Jordan," I said, nodding in mock approval. "If a traditional commercial bank still held the note, you could absolutely stall them in court for years. You could hide behind legal red tape and exploit the system just like you always do. But you missed one crucial detail in your brilliant legal analysis. Big commercial banks absolutely hate carrying toxic debt on their books. They prefer to cut their losses and clean up their balance sheets quickly. So 2 months ago, the bank bundled Gordon's defaulted mortgage and sold it off to the highest bidder. They sold the entire debt to an aggressive private equity firm specializing in distressed asset acquisitions. A private equity firm called Apex Holdings. Jordan frowned, his brow furrowing as he tried to recognize the corporate name. Apex Holdings. He muttered, the false confidence rapidly draining from his voice once again. "I have never heard of them in this county." I reached into the inside breast pocket of my tailored blazer. The dining room fell into absolute silence once more, the only sound the crackling of the logs in the grand fireplace. I pulled out a crisp, heavy stock, matte, black business card. I held it between my index and middle fingers for a brief second before tossing it lightly onto the white tablecloth. It slid smoothly across the fabric, coming to a dead stop right next to Jordan's dinner plate. "Read it," I commanded, my voice dropping to a low, icy register. Jordan slowly reached out his hand, visibly shaking, and picked up the card. He stared at the silver-embossed lettering. His jaw went completely slack. Melanie leaned over his shoulder to look at the card, her eyes widening in pure disbelief. Printed in sharp, elegant silver letters was the name Apex Holdings, and right below it, printed in bold, undeniable font, was my name. Cassidy, sole owner and chief executive officer. I looked directly into my younger sister's wide, horrified, staring eyes. "I am not just your family member anymore, Melanie," I said smoothly. "I am now your brand new creditor." The dining room exploded into absolute chaos. Beatrice leaped up from her chair, her face contorted with a mixture of shock and sheer rage. She pointed a trembling finger at me, knocking over her crystal champagne flute in the process. The expensive liquid spilled across the white tablecloth, dripping onto the hardwood floor, but no one seemed to care. "How dare you!" Beatrice screamed, her voice shrill and echoing off the high ceilings. "You absolute monster! You predatory little snake! You swooped in and bought your own father's debt just to hold it over our heads. What kind of sick, twisted daughter preys on her own flesh and blood like a vulture waiting for a carcass?" I did not raise my voice to match hers. I simply stood my ground at the head of the table, perfectly composed. "You are confusing consequence with predation, Mother," I replied evenly. "A predator hunts the innocent. I merely collected the financial receipts you carelessly left behind." While Beatrice was having her theatrical meltdown, Jordan was frantically pulling his phone from his suit jacket. His thumb flew across the bright screen as he desperately logged into the state property registry portal. He was searching for the county lien records, praying that my heavy black business card was just an elaborate, malicious bluff. Melanie was hyperventilating next to him, clutching his arm and begging him to do something to fix the nightmare I had just unleashed upon her perfect evening. "You want to talk about flesh and blood?" I continued, my voice easily cutting through the panicked murmurs of the wealthy guests who were now practically frozen in their seats. "Let us break down the exact cost of being a member of this family. 3 years ago, I wired Gordon $60,000 for a $12,000 medical bill. Last spring, I paid $45,000 to clear Melanie's credit cards so she could maintain her fake socialite lifestyle in Paris. And 8 months ago, when the bank finally called the $500,000 commercial loan that Gordon defaulted on, I was the one who stepped in. My firm bought that toxic debt for pennies on the dollar because the bank knew Gordon was a terrible investment who would never pay them back." I walked slowly down the side of the table, my heels clicking sharply against the floor, forcing the terrified neighbors to pull their chairs in to let me pass. "And how did my flesh and blood repay my endless generosity?" I asked the room. "You repaid me by treating me like an embarrassing secret. You repaid me by trying to banish me to a wobbly folding table in the corner while you celebrated my absence. You tried to legally evict me from the very property I saved from foreclosure, offering to rent me the pool house like a peasant. And to top it all off, you invited the brother-in-law who broke into my Manhattan apartment to steal my $12,000 vintage Cartier watch so he could wear it to Thanksgiving dinner." Jordan suddenly stopped typing on his phone. The color drained from his face for the third time that evening. He slowly lowered his device, staring blankly ahead. He found it. He found the officially recorded transfer of the lien to Apex Holdings. It was not a bluff. It was a legally binding reality, and it was entirely bulletproof. The massive, crippling debt attached to the Greenwich estate was real, and it was now solely owned by my company. Melanie burst into dramatic, heaving sobs, burying her face in her hands. She realized that her multi-million-dollar gift was actually a massive financial trap. "We are ruined," she wailed, her mascara running down her cheeks. "He transferred the title to us, Mom. Jordan put the debt in our names." But Jordan was an ambitious attorney who refused to accept defeat without a brutal fight. He swallowed hard, his jaw clenching as he forced himself to stand up straight. He shoved his phone back into his pocket and glared at me, a nasty, desperate sneer twisting his features. His charismatic facade was completely gone, replaced by the cornered animal underneath. "You think you are so brilliant, Cassidy," he spat, pointing a finger directly at my chest. "You think you have us backed into a corner with your little corporate buyout. But you forgot one massive detail. You forgot about the ultimate safety net." I stopped walking and tilted my head, waiting for his final pathetic play. "We do not need to fight you in court," Jordan sneered, his voice ringing with renewed, desperate confidence. We do not even need to stall the foreclosure. We can pay off the entire debt tomorrow morning and clear the lien immediately. Because we still have your grandfather's trust fund, I will just authorize a full withdrawal from the family trust to pay Apex Holdings in full. You will get your money, but you will not get this house, and you will certainly not get the satisfaction of watching us lose. Jordan stood a little taller, straightening his silk tie as if he had just won a Supreme Court case. The sheer relief in the room was palpable. Beatrice let out a sound that was half sob and half laugh, pressing her hand against her chest as if her heart had just restarted. Gordon finally lifted his head from his hands, a spark of desperate hope returning to his dull eyes. The wealthy neighbors shifted back into comfortable positions, murmuring their approval of Jordan and his quick legal thinking. Even Melanie wiped her tears away, her signature smug smile slowly creeping back onto her face as she looked at her husband with pure admiration. They all believed they had finally backed me into a corner. "You see, Cassidy," Jordan said, his voice dripping with that familiar patronizing tone, "you are not the only one who knows how to move money around." When Gordon and Beatrice transferred the deed to us, I immediately conducted a full financial review of the family assets. I saw the impending issues with the estate, so I took the liberty of initiating a substantial withdrawal from your late grandfather Theodore and his family trust. The funds are currently sitting in a secure escrow account under my law firm. First thing tomorrow morning, I will wire the exact payoff amount to your little private equity firm. The lien will be cleared immediately. The house will remain ours, and you will be officially out of our lives forever. He crossed his arms over his chest, looking down his nose at me. It was the ultimate checkmate in his mind. He was using my own grandfather and his money to defeat me, preserving the toxic family dynamic that kept him living in absolute luxury. I did not interrupt him. I let him bask in his imaginary victory for a few long, agonizing seconds. The fire popped loudly in the hearth behind him, casting long shadows across the dining room walls. I reached down to the spare chair where I had draped my winter coat earlier. I slipped my hand into the deep interior pocket and pulled out a thick manila envelope. The heavy paper made a crisp, sharp sound as I held it up in the quiet room. "That is fascinating, Jordan," I said, keeping my voice completely level. "That is a truly remarkable piece of financial maneuvering for a real estate lawyer." Jordan scoffed, rolling his eyes dramatically for the benefit of the watching guests. "It is just basic estate law, Cassidy. Something a corporate spreadsheet pusher like you would not understand." I took a slow step forward, holding the envelope with both hands. "It is fascinating," I repeated, completely ignoring his insult. "Because according to the legally binding documents drafted by my grandfather before he passed away, there is only one person on this entire earth who has the legal authority to move money out of that specific trust. He knew Gordon was terrible with finances, so he named a single sole executor to oversee every single penny, and that executor is me. So I find it incredibly interesting that you managed to initiate a withdrawal, because as the sole executor of that trust, I never authorized a single transaction." The smug smile vanished from Jordan instantly. The color drained from his face for the fourth time that night, leaving him looking like a ghost. Melanie grabbed his arm, her manicured nails digging into his expensive suit jacket. "Jordan," she whispered, her voice trembling with sudden panic. "What is she talking about? You told me the trust money was ours. You told me you filed the paperwork perfectly." I did not wait for his excuse. I opened the manila envelope and pulled out a thick stack of official bank statements and heavily highlighted transaction logs. I walked directly over to the center of the dining table. With a quick flick of my wrist, I dropped the entire stack of documents right onto the silver platter holding the untouched Thanksgiving turkey. The papers fanned out across the table, sliding past crystal glasses and expensive china plates. "Those are the official transaction records from the trust account spanning the last 6 months," I announced to the completely silent room. "And they show a very clear, very deliberate pattern. 3 months ago, a wire transfer for $50,000 was sent to a private account held by Melanie. 2 months ago, another transfer for $40,000. And just last week, a final transfer of $60,000 was routed directly into the operating account of Jordan and his law firm. That is a grand total of $150,000 siphoned out of a protected family trust. Gordon stared at the papers on the table, his mouth opening and closing silently. Beatrice gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles turning white. But the most interesting part of these documents is the signature line on the authorization forms. I continued, my voice echoing off the high ceilings. Because the signature on those forms says Cassidy. But I never signed them. You two forged my signature to steal $150,000 from a federal trust account. You committed felony wire fraud and grand larceny to fund your fake lifestyle. And unlike a defaulted mortgage, the penalty for that is not just a foreclosure. The penalty for that is federal prison. The word prison hung in the air, heavy and absolute. Jordan stared at the highlighted bank statements scattered across the silver turkey platter, his entire body going rigid. The arrogant, smooth-talking real estate attorney who had just boasted about his ironclad legal maneuvers was completely gone. In his place stood a terrified man watching his entire life evaporate before his eyes. As an attorney, Jordan knew exactly what those forged signatures meant. He knew the State Bar Association would not just revoke his license to practice law. They would make a very public example of him. Notary fraud, embezzlement from a federal trust, and grand larceny carried mandatory minimum sentences. He was not looking at a gentle slap on the wrist. He was looking at years behind cold steel bars wearing a cheap jumpsuit instead of a tailored silk suit, permanently stripped of every ounce of power and prestige he had ruthlessly accumulated. He opened his mouth, desperately trying to formulate a defense, a loophole, any legal jargon to save himself. But his throat worked soundlessly. The undeniable proof was sitting right in front of him, bearing his own law firm routing numbers. Melanie could not process the heavy silence. She looked frantically from the documents on the table to her husband, studying his pale, sweat-slicked face. "Jordan," she pleaded, her voice trembling as she reached out to grab his expensive sleeve. "Tell her she is lying. Tell them you did not do this. You are a brilliant lawyer. You know the law. Tell them this is just another one of her stupid financial spreadsheets making a massive mistake." She picked up one of the bank statements, her manicured fingers shaking so violently the paper rattled. She stared at the forged signature, then at the massive transfer amounts. But the numbers did not lie, and Jordan refusing to speak was the loudest confession possible. "Say something," Melanie shrieked, dropping the paper back onto the table as if it had physically burned her skin. "Tell me we are not going to jail. Tell me my baby is not going to be born while its father is locked in a federal penitentiary." Something inside Jordan finally snapped. The sheer terror of his impending ruin mutated instantly into vicious, self-preserving rage. He violently yanked his arm away from Melanie and spun around to face Gordon and Beatrice. "Do not look at me like I am the only criminal here," Jordan roared, his voice cracking under the intense pressure. He pointed a shaking finger directly at my father. "You are the ones who pushed me into this absolute nightmare. You are the ones who came to me begging for a miracle when the bank sent the final foreclosure notices." Gordon flinched, shrinking back into his chair as Jordan advanced on him. "You told me if I did not find the money immediately, you would be completely ruined," Jordan yelled, spit flying from his lips. "Beatrice told me she would rather die than let the country club know her husband was a total failure. You manipulated me into this. You said Cassidy had plenty of money and would never even notice it was missing from the family trust. You made me forge those documents to save your pathetic social status. I risked my entire career, my entire future, just to keep the lights on in this ridiculous mansion for you." Beatrice gasped loudly, pressing both hands against her mouth, her eyes wide with exposed guilt. Gordon squeezed his eyes shut, letting out another muffled sob. They had not just spent the stolen money. They had actively conspired to steal it together, dragging their golden child and her husband down with them. The entire toxic foundation of their perfect family was finally laid bare for everyone in the room to see. It was a masterpiece of pure greed, emotional manipulation, and profound stupidity. The wealthy neighbors sitting around the table had heard enough. The polite, uncomfortable silence that had previously masked the tension shattered completely. These were people who carefully protected their reputations and their financial assets at all costs. They instantly recognized the radioactive fallout of a massive felony fraud case, and they wanted absolutely nothing to do with it. The prominent local socialite sitting to my right abruptly stood up her heavy chair, screeching harshly against the hardwood floor. She did not say a single word to Beatrice or Gordon. She simply turned her back, grabbed her expensive cashmere wrap from the back of her chair, and began walking briskly toward the hallway. Her husband followed immediately, his face set in a grim, panicked line. Suddenly it was a rapid chain reaction. Chair after chair pushed back. The guests scrambled to their feet, abandoning their meals and grabbing their expensive coats. The panic was contagious. Beatrice realized in a split second that her curated social kingdom was collapsing right before her eyes. She lunged forward, her silk dress catching on the edge of the mahogany table, and sprinted toward the grand foyer. "Please wait," she begged, her voice pitching into a hysterical squeal. "You cannot leave right now. We have not even served dessert. It is just a misunderstanding. Cassidy is making things up." She threw her arms out wide, physically blocking the double doors leading to the coat room. She looked like a desperate animal trying to herd them back into cages. But the illusion was broken. The prominent socialite simply pushed past her without a word. The silence of that rejection was brutal. Beatrice grabbed a bank executive by the sleeve, but he yanked away. "I am sorry, Beatrice," he muttered, not making eye contact. "We must be going." It was the ultimate social death. For my entire life, Beatrice and Gordon cared more about the opinions of these people than their own flesh and blood. They sacrificed my finances and emotional well-being just to maintain a flawless facade for these neighbors. Now those same neighbors were trampling over each other to escape the fallout of my family's crimes. Melanie stood frozen in the dining room, watching her mother beg people who refused to look at her. Gordon remained slumped in his chair at the head of the table. He did not move to help his wife. He just stared blankly at the scattered bank statements proving his ruin. He was a defeated man who realized he had lost everything. The foyer was a chaotic mess of rustling coats, muffled apologies, and the squeak of expensive shoes. Beatrice was sobbing now, reaching out to anyone walking past. Then, cutting through the chaotic noise of fleeing guests, came a sound that froze the blood in everyone's veins. It was a loud, authoritative knocking on the solid oak front doors. The sound echoed massively through the high, vaulted ceilings of the foyer. It was not the polite tap of a late dinner guest. It was the heavy, aggressive, rhythmic pounding of someone demanding immediate and absolute entry. The guests froze, hands pausing on the brass doorknobs. Beatrice whipped her head around, her eyes wide with terror and desperate hope. Perhaps she thought it was a distraction from the nightmare unfolding in her dining room. She stumbled backward, her heels slipping on the polished marble floor, and allowed one of the fleeing guests to pull the heavy front door open. A blast of freezing winter wind swept violently into the warm foyer, carrying a heavy flurry of white snow with it. Standing on the front porch, illuminated by the glow of the outdoor carriage lights, were three imposing figures. Leading the group was Miles. He was my corporate lawyer, a ruthless litigator who specialized in dismantling corrupt companies and aggressive asset recovery. He was dressed in a pristine charcoal overcoat and a thick cashmere scarf, holding a black leather briefcase. He looked completely unbothered by the freezing snowstorm swirling around him. Flanking him on either side were two massive uniformed county sheriffs. The brass badges on their dark winter coats glinted sharply under the porch lights. Their hands rested casually but purposefully near their utility belts. The sheer visual impact of law enforcement standing on the porch of a Greenwich estate was devastating. The fleeing guests parted instantly, pressing themselves against the walls like frightened sheep making way for wolves. Nobody in the room dared to speak or breathe. Miles stepped across the threshold, his polished shoes clicking loudly against the marble floor. He did not bother wiping the white snow from his shoes. He did not greet Beatrice, who was standing there just a few feet away with her mouth hanging open. He did not acknowledge the wealthy neighbors, cowering nervously against the expensive wallpaper. His sharp, calculating eyes scanned the foyer and immediately locked onto me standing in the dining room. I gave him a single brief, confident nod. Miles walked straight past Beatrice, as if she were invisible, marching directly into the dining room with the two uniformed officers right behind him. He stopped at the edge of the table, glancing briefly at the panicked faces of Jordan and Melanie, and then at the broken figure of Gordon. Miles unclasped his briefcase with a sharp snap that echoed in the quiet room. He reached inside and pulled out a thick stack of legally stamped documents. He turned to the taller sheriff standing to his right. He handed the officer the stack of papers without a trace of emotion on his face. Then Miles slowly raised his hand and pointed a perfectly manicured finger directly at Gordon and Beatrice. The taller of the two uniformed sheriffs stepped forward, following Miles' silent direction. His heavy black boots thudded against the hardwood floor of the dining room, a sound that shattered the fragile illusion of wealth my parents had spent decades building. He bypassed the terrified, lingering guests huddled near the foyer and walked directly to the head of the long mahogany table. Gordon did not look up. The sheriff held out the thick stack of legally stamped documents. Gordon was trembling so violently he could not lift his hands to accept them. Recognizing the absolute paralysis of the defeated man, the sheriff simply dropped the heavy stack of papers right onto the table. The documents landed with a loud slap next to the silver platter, and the scattered bank statements proving my sister and her husband had stolen from my grandfather. These are your official copies of the immediate notice of foreclosure and the emergency writ of possession. The sheriff announced, his deep voice carrying an uncompromising authority. This property has been legally reclaimed by the lien holder Apex Holdings. The emergency eviction order was reviewed and signed by a county judge at exactly 3 o'clock this afternoon. You are required to vacate these premises immediately. For a moment nobody breathed. The reality of the words hung in the warm air, mixing with the scent of roasted turkey and spilled wine. Then Beatrice finally snapped out of her shocked paralysis. Her face twisted into a mask of pure hysterical outrage. She slammed her hands down on the table, her rings clattering against the wood. "You cannot do this!" she screamed, her voice cracking under the intense emotional strain. "This is Thanksgiving night. It is a national holiday. It is completely illegal to evict a family from their own home on a holiday. You cannot throw us out into a freezing snowstorm. I know my rights. I know the laws in this county. You must leave right now and return on Monday." She pointed at the front door. Miles did not even blink. He adjusted his thick cashmere scarf and let out a short, cold corporate chuckle. It was a sound devoid of any warmth. "You are confusing a standard residential lease agreement with a commercial asset seizure," Beatrice Miles said smoothly. He stepped closer to the table, his presence commanding the entire room. Under Connecticut legal statute regarding distressed commercial obligations, a corporate entity executing a writ of possession on a severely delinquent commercial loan does not observe bank holidays. Apex Holdings is not your landlord. Apex Holdings is the private equity firm that owns the massive debt you secured against this estate. The judge granted the emergency eviction order without a mandatory grace period for a very specific reason. Miles turned his sharp gaze toward Jordan, who was still standing frozen next to Melanie. "The judge expedited the seizure because your brilliant son-in-law attempted to fraudulently transfer the title of a heavily encumbered property across state lines to avoid a debt collection," Miles explained, speaking slowly so everyone could understand the mistake. By filing that fraudulent deed transfer this morning, Jordan legally proved that the original borrowers had abandoned their financial claim. "You handed us the ultimate legal loophole." The judge classified the estate as an unsecured risk tied to an active felony fraud investigation. Beatrice whipped her head around to look at Jordan. The pure hatred in her eyes was toxic. Melanie let out a high-pitched wail, burying her face in her hands as she realized her husband had actually accelerated their entire downfall. Gordon kept his head down. Miles casually checked his expensive wristwatch. "It is currently 8:15 in the evening," he announced to the silent room. You have exactly 20 minutes to gather whatever personal clothing you can carry and vacate my client's private property. Anyone remaining inside this structure at 8:35 will be arrested for criminal trespassing. The finality of his words settled over the dining room like a heavy winter blanket. But the nightmare was not over yet. The second sheriff, who had remained standing quietly near the doorway, suddenly moved. He reached down to his thick leather utility belt and unclipped a pair of heavy steel handcuffs. The metallic clinking sound was deafening. He walked past Gordon and Beatrice, stepping directly up to Jordan. The sheriff looked the attorney up and down. Jordan, the officer, commanded, his voice echoing, "Step away from the table and put your hands behind your back. I have an active felony warrant for your arrest regarding wire fraud and the forgery of federal trust documents." Jordan stepped back, his shoes scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. He raised both hands in a practiced defensive gesture he frequently used in courtrooms. "Officer, you are making a massive procedural error," Jordan said, his voice dropping into a deep, authoritative baritone. He was desperately trying to project power, but the uncontrollable tremor in his hands betrayed his panic. "As a licensed attorney in Connecticut, I can assure you that this warrant is based on unverified allegations from a hostile family member. You do not have the jurisdiction to execute a financial warrant of this magnitude without a prior grand jury indictment." The sheriff did not blink. He had dealt with arrogant white-collar criminals before. He stepped closer, closing the distance between them with slow, purposeful strides. "I am not here to debate penal codes or civil jurisdiction with you, counselor," the sheriff replied, his voice flat and uncompromising. "The warrant is signed by a federal magistrate. The charges are wire fraud and grand larceny. Turn around and place your hands behind your back right now. If you resist, I will add obstruction of justice to your charges." Jordan shook his head, looking frantically around the dining room as if an invisible jury might save him. "This is a clear violation of my civil rights," he sputtered, his polished professional facade cracking completely to reveal the terrified fraud underneath. "You cannot just walk into a private residence on Thanksgiving night and arrest an officer of the court based on hearsay." The sheriff sighed heavily, clearly bored by the empty, desperate threats. He lunged forward with surprising speed. He grabbed Jordan firmly by the biceps, spun him around roughly, and shoved him face first against the edge of the dining table. The heavy mahogany table shuddered violently under the sudden impact. Jordan gasped as his chest hit the solid wood, his cheek pressing directly against the cold silver platter holding the untouched Thanksgiving turkey. The crystal gravy boat tipped over, spilling hot brown liquid across the pristine white tablecloth and splashing directly onto the sleeve of his tailored suit. "You are making a huge mistake," Jordan yelled, his voice muffled by the roasted turkey and the silver platter. But his protests were abruptly cut short by the sharp metallic click of cold steel snapping shut around his left wrist. The sheriff yanked Jordan's right arm behind his back, twisting it just enough to make him grunt in genuine pain, and secured the second cuff. The sound of the lock clicking into place echoed loudly in the silent dining room. It was the undeniable finalizing sound of absolute ruin. The sheriff immediately began reading Jordan his Miranda rights. Melanie watched the metal bracelets lock around her husband's wrists and completely lost her mind. She lunged forward blindly, grabbing the sheriff by the shoulder of his uniform. "Let him go!" she screamed, hot tears streaming down her perfectly contoured face, ruining her makeup. "You cannot take him away. He is a lawyer. We are having a baby. You are ruining our lives." The first sheriff, who had just served the eviction papers, immediately stepped in. He grabbed Melanie by the shoulders and firmly pulled her back, creating a physical barrier. "Ma'am, step back right now, or you will be detained and placed in the back of a cruiser for interfering with a lawful arrest," he warned, leaving absolutely no room for negotiation. Melanie stumbled backward, her chest heaving as she sobbed uncontrollably. She looked at Jordan, who was now being yanked to his feet by the arresting officer. His suit was wrinkled and stained with spilled gravy. He looked pathetic and small. Melanie then spun around and locked her tear-filled eyes on me. She rushed toward me, stopping just a few inches away. "Cassidy, please!" Melanie begged, her voice cracking. She was finally begging the sister she had relentlessly mocked. "Please stop this right now. Tell them it was a massive misunderstanding. Tell them you gave him verbal permission to move the money. We will give the house back to you. We will give everything back. Just call off your lawyers and tell the police to let him go. Please, I am your sister." I looked down at her, taking in her ruined makeup and desperate expression. I felt no pity. I felt no triumphant joy. I felt the heavy burden of years of financial and emotional abuse finally lifting from my shoulders. I looked over at Gordon and Beatrice, who were watching this nightmare unfold in stunned silence, powerless to save their golden child. I looked back at Melanie's weeping face. "I am not doing anything," I said, my voice quiet but firm enough to shatter her last hope. "I am just letting you face the consequences you earned." Melanie stared at me as if I had just transformed into a monster right in front of her eyes. Her fiery anger was completely gone. It was replaced by a hollow realization that she had no power left. He gripped Jordan by the arm and marched him out of the dining room. Jordan stumbled over his own leather shoes, his head hanging low in absolute humiliation. He vanished into the foyer, escorted by law enforcement. The front door closed, sealing his fate. The sound of the door closing acted like a starting pistol for my sister. Melanie gasped, suddenly snapping out of her frozen state. She spun around and sprinted toward the hallway closet where the guests had left their coats. "I have to go!" Melanie cried out loudly. "I have to follow them down to the county station. I need to call his law partners. I need to arrange bail." She tore through the coats, tossing them onto the floor. She finally found her designer handbag and her thick winter coat. She shoved her arms into the sleeves, her hands shaking so violently she could barely manage the buttons. She dug into her purse and pulled out a set of keys. "I am going to the station," she yelled. "I will personally fix this. I will get him out tonight." Beatrice took a step forward, reaching out a trembling hand toward her golden child. But before she could speak, a strange noise interrupted her. It was a loud, heavy mechanical whirring sound coming from the front driveway, piercing clearly through the howling wind of the snowstorm outside. It was accompanied by the deep, throaty rumble of a massive diesel engine and the sharp clanking of heavy metal chains. It was not the sound of a police cruiser pulling away. It was something much larger and far more industrial. Gordon lifted his head from his hands, his bloodshot eyes darting toward the front windows. The mechanical grinding grew louder, vibrating through the thick glass panes of the colonial estate. Melanie froze, her car keys dangling from her shaking fingers. She dropped her designer bag onto the floor and rushed to the tall front window next to the heavy oak door. She pressed her face against the cold glass, peering out into the swirling white snow illuminated by the bright exterior carriage lights. A sudden piercing scream ripped from her throat. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated agony. "No!" Melanie shrieked, slamming her palms against the window pane. "Stop them! Hey, you cannot do that! Stop right now!" She fumbled wildly with the brass locks of the front door, throwing it open and rushing out onto the snowy porch. I walked slowly into the foyer, standing just behind Beatrice to watch the scene unfold. Parked squarely in the middle of the circular driveway was a massive rusted commercial tow truck. Its bright yellow hazard lights were flashing rhythmically, casting eerie shadows across the fresh snow. And suspended in the air behind it, secured by heavy metal hooks and thick industrial chains, was Melanie's pristine white Range Rover. The luxury SUV she had proudly flaunted on social media all month was being unceremoniously dragged onto the flatbed of the truck. Melanie ran to the edge of the icy porch, waving her arms frantically at the driver in the cab. "That is my car!" she screamed into the freezing wind, her expensive coat flapping wildly around her legs. "Put it down right now. I have the keys. You are stealing my vehicle." The tow truck driver ignored her, completely pulling a heavy lever that locked the winch into place with a loud, final metallic clang. He climbed into the cab and shifted the massive truck into gear. I stepped past Beatrice and walked out onto the freezing porch, feeling the sharp bite of the winter air against my face. I did not wear a coat, but the adrenaline rushing through my veins kept me perfectly warm. Melanie spun around to face me, her chest heaving, pointing a shaking finger at the departing tow truck. "They are stealing my car," she sobbed hysterically. "Call the police." But I did not reach for my phone. Instead, I calmly reached into my blazer pocket and pulled out a crisp, folded piece of paper. I held the vehicle title up in the freezing wind, letting the yellow hazard lights illuminate the official state seal. "You bought that luxury vehicle using the exact same federal trust account you and your husband siphoned money from last week," I said, my voice steady and cold. "The financial auditors traced the wire transfer directly to the dealership. That car is not yours. It is evidence now." I looked down at the keys dangling uselessly from her frozen fingers. "You are walking. You are walking." The words hit Melanie with the force of a physical blow. She stared at the empty space where her prized luxury vehicle had been just moments ago, the flashing yellow lights of the tow truck disappearing down the dark snow-covered road. Her entire identity, built on internet validation and expensive material possessions, had just been towed away on a flatbed. She let out a pathetic whimper, her knees buckling as the wind whipped around us. She did not scream anymore. The fight had been completely drained out of her. She slowly turned around and stumbled back inside the warm foyer, looking like a shattered porcelain doll. I followed her back inside, closing the front door against the bitter winter storm. Inside the foyer, the situation had deteriorated into absolute social carnage. The last few remaining wealthy neighbors who had lingered near the coat closet hoping the police presence would resolve quietly were now desperately trying to escape. They had witnessed the arrest, the tow truck, and the undeniable proof of massive financial fraud. The stench of failure was suffocating, and in Fairfield County, failure was a highly contagious disease. Beatrice saw her lifelong friends buttoning their designer coats and wrapping their cashmere scarves, refusing to make eye contact with her. The pristine social facade she had violently protected for decades was crumbling into dust right before her eyes. The reality of having nowhere to sleep and no money to her name finally broke her mind. Beatrice lunged forward, throwing herself onto the polished marble floor of the grand foyer. She landed hard on her knees, the expensive silk of her Thanksgiving dress bunching up around her legs. "Please," Beatrice begged, her voice a raw, desperate sob. She reached out and grabbed the hem of a long wool coat belonging to a prominent local judge she had played tennis with for 15 years. "Richard, please do not leave us like this. You have a massive guest house on your estate. Just let us stay the night. Just until Gordon can call his broker on Monday morning and sort out this terrible misunderstanding. We just need a small bridge loan. We are good people. We are your friends." The judge flinched, looking down at my mother as if she were a stranger covered in filth. He quickly yanked the hem of his expensive coat out of her desperate grasp, taking a large step backward toward the heavy oak door. Beatrice scrambled forward on her hands and knees, turning her tear-streaked face toward a wealthy couple she had hosted for dinner countless times. "Susan," she pleaded, her voice cracking pitifully. "Susan, you know me. I am the chair of the charity gala. You know my heart. Please lend us the money to clear this lien. I swear we will pay you back with interest. Do not let my family get thrown out into the snow." Susan tightened her grip on her designer handbag, her face flushed with extreme discomfort. She looked away from Beatrice, her eyes darting nervously toward the uniformed sheriff standing near the dining room entrance. The wealthy couple exchanged a brief, horrified glance. They did not see a friend in need. They saw a toxic liability that could drag their own pristine reputations down into the mud. Susan finally looked down at my mother kneeling on the floor. Her expression was completely devoid of pity. It was filled only with cold, calculated revulsion. "This is embarrassing, Beatrice," Susan muttered, her voice sharp and low. "Get a hold of yourself." Susan turned her back, grabbed her husband by the arm, and practically ran out the front door. The judge followed immediately behind them, pulling his collar up against the cold without a single backward glance. The heavy front door clicked shut. The massive estate was completely empty of guests. The festive Thanksgiving party that had begun with a toast celebrating my absence had ended in absolute ruin. The lively chatter, the clinking crystal glasses, and the arrogant laughter were entirely gone. The silence that fell over the foyer was heavy and oppressive. Gordon was still slumped in the dining room, a broken man staring at his forged bank statements. Melanie was sitting on the bottom step of the grand staircase, shivering uncontrollably in her winter coat, staring blankly at the floor. Beatrice remained collapsed on the cold marble, weeping loudly into her hands, completely abandoned by the society she worshipped. Only the broken family, my ruthless corporate lawyer Miles, and the imposing county sheriff remained in the house. Miles casually pulled back his sleeve, checking his expensive watch once again. "You have exactly 12 minutes left to pack your belongings," Miles announced, his voice echoing sharply through the cavernous foyer. "The clock is ticking down now." Gordon slowly pushed himself up from the heavy mahogany chair. He looked like he had aged 20 years in a single hour. His shoulders were slumped and his tailored suit hung loosely on his frame. He walked out of the dining room and stepped into the grand foyer, his shoes dragging across the marble floor. He stopped a few feet away from where I stood next to Miles. Gordon looked at his weeping wife on the floor, then at his shattered golden child on the stairs, before locking his bloodshot eyes on me. He took a deep breath, attempting to summon the patriarchal authority he had wielded over me for my entire life. But that authority was completely gone. So he tried a different tactic. He tried to play the sentimental father. "Cassidy, please," Gordon whispered, his voice cracking with emotion. He took a step closer, reaching out a trembling hand as if to touch my shoulder. I immediately took a step back, maintaining a physical distance between us. Gordon let his hand drop to his side, letting out a pathetic sigh. "You are my daughter," he pleaded, forcing a tear to well up in his eye. "We are blood. I remember when you were just a little girl. I spent an entire weekend teaching you how to ride your first bicycle on this driveway. You kept falling, scraping your knees on the asphalt, but you never cried. You always got right back up. You were always so strong and independent. You were my brave little girl. Do not throw your own family out into the snow. We can fix this. Call off your lawyers and give us a chance to rebuild our bond." I stared at the man who contributed half of my genetics, feeling absolutely nothing but clinical disgust. It was pathetic watching him weaponize a 25-year-old memory to save his real estate portfolio. I did not blink and I did not soften my posture. "Stop!" I said, my voice cutting through his fake sentimentality like a sharpened blade. "Do not ever try to use my childhood against me." "You want to talk about memories, Gordon? Let us talk about the exact moment I realized you did not love me. Let us talk about the summer before I started college at New York University. I was 18 years old, sitting at the kitchen table crying because my financial aid package fell through. You looked me right in the eye and told me the family business was struggling. You told me you could not afford to help me with tuition. You handed me a stack of federal student loan applications and told me that debt builds character. Gordon swallowed hard, his eyes darting nervously toward Miles, who was watching the exchange with cold professional interest. "Cassidy, I did what I thought was best for you," Gordon stammered, his face flushing a deep red. "I wanted to teach you responsibility." "You wanted to teach me responsibility?" I repeated, a humorless laugh escaping my lips. That is a fascinating excuse, because 3 days after I signed the paperwork binding myself to $80,000 of predatory student loan debt, a flatbed delivery truck pulled into this exact driveway. It was carrying a brand new luxury convertible wrapped in a giant red bow, a gift for Melanie just for graduating high school. You let your brave little girl mortgage her entire future to pay for an education while you secretly drained the family accounts to buy a sports car for the daughter you actually liked. That was the day I stopped being your daughter, Gordon. That was the day I became nothing more than a financial transaction to you. Gordon opened his mouth, desperately searching for a lie to cover the truth, but I did not give him the chance. I turned to the hall closet directly behind me, pulled open the heavy wooden door, and reached down to the bottom shelf. I grabbed a fresh box of industrial black trash bags. I tore 3 empty bags from the roll and threw them directly at Gordon's feet. The plastic landed on the marble floor with a soft, dismissive rustle. You used up 8 minutes of your eviction countdown trying to manipulate me with a bicycle story, I said, my voice completely void of emotion. You have exactly 12 minutes left to gather your entire life. You are allowed to take whatever personal clothing fits into those 3 black trash bags. Anything left behind becomes property of Apex Holdings. If you are not walking out that front door when the clock strikes the bottom of the hour, the sheriff will escort you out with absolutely nothing. Pack your bags, Gordon. The words hung in the air, absolute and final. Gordon stared at the 3 black industrial trash bags resting on the polished marble floor. For a second, I thought he might try to summon a final scrap of dignity to fight back. Instead, his shoulders slumped. He slowly bent down, his joints popping audibly in the quiet foyer, and picked up the bags. He handed one to his weeping wife and one to his shivering daughter. The reality of their eviction finally broke through their delusions. Panic, raw and ugly, took over. With 12 minutes remaining, the 3 of them scrambled up the grand staircase. They pushed past each other, their shoes slipping on the carpeted steps, driven by the desperate instinct to salvage whatever they could. I walked up the stairs behind them, accompanied by the taller county sheriff. I had no intention of letting them out of my sight. Miles remained downstairs, casually leaning against the front door, timing their ruin on his expensive watch. When we reached the second-floor landing, the family had already scattered into their respective bedrooms. I followed the sheriff directly into the master suite. The room was a complete disaster. Beatrice had ignored her closet full of expensive dresses. Instead, she was frantically emptying her mahogany jewelry box onto the king-sized bed. Diamond bracelets and pearl necklaces clattered against each other. She swept them up in her trembling hands, trying to shove them into the trash bag. Next to the bed, Gordon was attempting to remove an oil painting from the bedroom wall. "Hold it right there," the sheriff barked, his deep voice startling them both. He stepped into the room and placed a heavy hand over the opening of Beatrice's trash bag. "Put the jewelry back on the bed, ma'am. And, sir, put that painting back on the wall immediately." Beatrice clutched the bag to her chest, her eyes wide with frantic defiance. "These are my personal belongings," she shrieked loudly, her face flushed red with panic. "You said we could pack our things. You cannot take my jewelry." The sheriff did not flinch. He easily pried the plastic bag from her grip and dumped the glittering jewelry back onto the silk bedspread. "The foreclosure order covers the entire estate and all high-value assets contained within it to satisfy the outstanding commercial debt." He explained, his tone completely devoid of sympathy. "My client now legally owns every fixture, piece of artwork, and luxury item in this house. You are permitted to take everyday clothing, basic toiletries, and vital identification documents. If you conceal stolen assets in those bags, I will arrest you right here." Beatrice let out a strangled gasp, staring at the pile of diamonds she was forced to abandon. The wealth she had spent her life accumulating was suddenly untouchable. Gordon silently rehung the painting, his hands shaking so violently it hung crooked against the expensive wallpaper. He turned away, opening a dresser drawer to blindly grab handfuls of socks and underwear, shoving them into his plastic bag like a common thief in his own home. I watched them for a long moment, feeling a cold and absolute satisfaction wash over me before turning my attention to the hallway. I stepped out of the master suite just in time to see Melanie emerging from her childhood bedroom. She was dragging her trash bag behind her. It was bulging at the seams, filled with designer jeans and cashmere sweaters. She hurried toward the large cedar closet at the end of the hallway, where the family stored their expensive winter wear. Beatrice rushed out of the master bedroom a second later, desperate to secure her own winter clothing. They reached the open closet doors at the exact same time. The tension between the mother and the golden child was a highly combustible element, and it instantly exploded. Beatrice reached out and grabbed a thick designer fur coat off its wooden hanger. Melanie dropped her trash bag and lunged forward, grabbing the other sleeve of the exact same coat. "Let go, Mom!" Melanie yelled, her voice shrill and panicked. "I need this one. It matches my boots." "You have 3 other coats in your bag already," Beatrice snarled, her maternal affection completely evaporating. Her face contorted into a selfish, ugly sneer. "Let go of it right now, Melanie. I am your mother." "I do not care!" Melanie screamed aggressively, yanking the fur coat with all her strength. My husband just went to jail. My car just got towed. I am taking this coat. They stood in the hallway of their crumbling empire, engaging in a vicious, pathetic tug of war over a simple piece of clothing. The absolute disintegration of their perfect family loyalty was finally on full public display. I turned my back at the pathetic scene unfolding in the upstairs hallway. Let them fight over fur coats and cashmere sweaters while their entire world collapsed around them. The sound of my mother and sister screaming at each other over a piece of clothing echoed off the high ceilings, a fitting soundtrack to their ruin. I walked slowly back down the grand staircase, trailing my hand along the polished mahogany banister for the very last time. The house, which had once felt like an intimidating fortress of my parents' expectations, now just felt like an empty, hollow shell. I reached the bottom step and walked into the foyer, just as the first sheriff was pushing the heavy front door wide open. A brutal gust of freezing wind howled through the entrance, bringing a flurry of white snowflakes onto the pristine marble floor. The sheriff was holding Jordan firmly by the bicep, preparing to march him out into the snowstorm and down to the waiting police cruiser. Jordan looked completely broken. The rich brown gravy from the Thanksgiving turkey was already drying into an ugly, crusty stain across the front of his expensive tailored suit jacket. His shoulders were hunched against the bitter cold, and his head hung low in absolute humiliation. He was no longer the arrogant, smooth-talking real estate attorney who had tried to intimidate me at the dinner table just an hour ago. He was just a terrified criminal, caught in his own web of lies, wearing handcuffs instead of a silk tie. "Officer! Wait a moment, please." I called out, my voice easily cutting through the howling wind of the storm outside. The sheriff paused, turning back to look at me while keeping a firm, unyielding grip on his prisoner. Jordan slowly lifted his head. His eyes were red-rimmed and bloodshot, filled with a mixture of pure exhaustion and venomous hatred. He glared at me, his jaw clenching so hard I could see a muscle ticking frantically in his cheek. "Before you take him down to the county station to process his booking, I need to reclaim a piece of stolen property," I said, walking deliberately across the marble floor until I was standing right in front of them. I pointed a steady finger directly at Jordan's left wrist, which was currently secured tightly behind his back by the heavy steel handcuffs. "The suspect is currently wearing my vintage Cartier tank watch. I filed a grand larceny report for that exact timepiece with the New York Police Department 3 weeks ago. I have the paperwork right here in my coat pocket if you need to verify the serial number." The sheriff glanced down at Jordan's constrained hands, spotting the gleaming silver and gold watch strapped to his wrist. He looked back up at me and gave a short confirming nod. "Go ahead and retrieve your property, ma'am," the sheriff said, shifting his grip slightly to expose Jordan's wrist more clearly. "But make it quick. We need to get him secured in the cruiser and out of this freezing weather." Jordan tried to pull his arm away, a final pathetic act of physical defiance, but the massive sheriff held him completely immobile. I stepped closer, invading his personal space, just as he had done to me earlier in the evening. I reached out and carefully grasped the leather strap of the watch. The metal buckle was freezing cold against my fingertips. I methodically unbuckled the strap, pulling the expensive timepiece free from his wrist. The physical act of taking it back felt like reclaiming a piece of my own dignity. As I held the watch in my hand, I noticed a smudge of sweat and a tiny smear of gravy on the glass face. I turned around, walked over to the dining room entrance, and picked up a clean white linen napkin from a side table. I walked back to the foyer and slowly, deliberately polished the crystal face of the watch right in front of Jordan. I wiped away every trace of him. Once it was perfectly clean, I wrapped the strap around my own left wrist and secured the buckle. It fit perfectly. Jordan watched me, his chest heaving with ragged, angry breaths. "You are a cold, miserable woman, Cassidy," he spat, his voice thick with venom and desperation. "You destroyed your own family tonight. You are going to end up completely alone in this world, sitting in a big, empty house with your spreadsheets, and nobody is ever going to love you." I looked at him, feeling absolutely no sting from his pathetic insult. He was projecting his own greatest fears onto me. I let a slow, genuine smile spread across my face as I adjusted the lapel of my tailored blazer. "Enjoy your phone call, Jordan," I replied, my voice calm and bright. "I hear the state bar acts extremely fast on felony charges." The sheriff gave Jordan a firm shove, marching him out through the heavy oak doors and directly into the heart of the swirling winter snowstorm. The flashing red and blue lights of the police cruiser cast harsh shadows across the pristine snowbanks. I watched the officer press Jordan's head down, guiding the disgraced attorney into the cramped back seat before slamming the metal door shut. That was one problem permanently removed. I turned my attention back to the grand staircase just as Miles checked his watch. "Your 20 minutes are officially up right now," Miles announced, his loud voice echoing up the empty hallway. "Come down immediately or the sheriff will physically escort you out." A few agonizing seconds passed before a slow, shuffling sound reached my ears. Gordon appeared at the top of the grand stairs first. He was tightly clutching two bulging black garbage bags. His posture was broken shoulders rounded under the invisible weight of his failure. Behind him came Beatrice, her face stained with ruined makeup, dragging her own plastic bag. She had grabbed her heavy wool coat, but her feet were shoved hastily into inappropriate leather loafers. Finally, Melanie descended. She wore the fur coat she fought for, but her bare hands were already trembling from the drafty air. They reached the bottom of the stairs, looking around the grand foyer as if hoping to wake up from a terrible nightmare. The second sheriff, who had remained inside to oversee the eviction, gestured toward the open front door. "Time to go, folks," the sheriff said, his tone leaving absolutely no room for delay. They walked toward the exit in a slow, miserable procession. Gordon kept his eyes locked on the floor. Beatrice paused just as she reached the threshold. She turned her head, fixing me with a look of profound devastation. She opened her mouth, perhaps to hurl one final insult or beg for mercy, but found nothing to say. I stared back at her with absolute indifference. I did not blink or flinch. She finally looked away, stepping out into the bitter winter night. Melanie followed quickly behind her parents. The sheriff stepped out right behind them, pulling the heavy oak door halfway shut to block out the worst of the storm, but leaving it open just enough for me to watch the aftermath. I stood comfortably in the warm foyer, the golden light from the crystal chandelier spilling out onto the snow-covered porch. Gordon and Beatrice stood frozen on the icy driveway, the cold wind whipping their expensive clothes around their shivering bodies. Melanie immediately pulled her smartphone from her pocket. Her fingers were shaking violently from the freezing temperature as she furiously tapped on the bright glass screen. "It is fine," Melanie shouted over the howling wind, her voice tight with panic. "I am getting an Uber Black. We will just go to a hotel downtown and figure this out in the morning." She stared at her screen, waiting for the confirmation. A second later, a bright red error message illuminated her pale face. She frowned deeply, her cold thumbs flying across the screen to quickly select a completely different payment method. She tried her platinum credit card. Declined. She tried her travel card. Declined. She tried a debit card linked to the joint family checking account. Insufficient available funds. Melanie gasped, staring at the phone in pure horror. "They declined," she cried out, looking up at her father. "Every single card is declining. The app will not let me book a ride." Of course they declined. The credit cards were linked to the accounts I had systematically frozen, and the checking account had been drained to pay the legal fees for the foreclosure. They had absolutely no liquid assets available, no cars, no cash, and no credit. Gordon dropped one of his trash bags onto the snow. "We have to walk to the main road," he muttered, his teeth beginning to chatter. "There is a bus stop about 2 miles down the highway. Maybe we can find a cheap motel that takes cash if I have any left." Beatrice let out a high-pitched wail of despair, realizing she would have to trek through a blizzard in leather loafers. But the sheriff took a step toward them, tapping his heavy flashlight against his palm, urging them to move off the private property immediately. With no other choice left to them, the three of them grabbed their cheap plastic garbage bags and began the agonizingly slow walk down the long, winding asphalt driveway. I stood silently in the doorway, the warm light of the mansion wrapping around me like a protective cloak, watching them drag their heavy bags through the freezing snow toward the dark main road. The figures of my family slowly vanished into the heavy white curtain of the snowstorm. I did not close the door right away. I stood there for another full minute, letting the freezing wind bite at my face, simply to make sure they did not turn back. They did not. The flashing yellow lights of the tow truck were long gone, and the red and blue lights of the police cruiser had faded into nothingness. The circular driveway was completely empty, marked only by the dragging tracks of cheap plastic trash bags in the fresh snow. It was the visual confirmation of a clean break. Finally, I pushed the heavy oak doors shut. The solid brass latch clicked into place with a satisfying permanent sound. The moment the doors sealed, the howling noise of the winter storm was completely severed. The sudden silence that fell over the massive foyer was absolute. It was not the tense, uncomfortable silence that usually preceded one of my mother's screaming tantrums. It was a profound, heavy quiet. The chaotic noise of my family, their arrogant laughter, their desperate screaming, their bitter fighting over fur coats, was entirely gone. The house belonged to me, and it was finally at peace. Miles was standing near the coat closet, casually brushing a few stray snowflakes from his tailored charcoal overcoat. He snapped his leather briefcase shut, the sound echoing sharply in the quiet entrance hall. He looked up at me, his sharp corporate eyes softening just a fraction for the very first time tonight. "Are you okay, Cassidy?" he asked, his voice low and professional. "It is a lot to process in one evening. Even for someone as prepared as you, were watching your blood relatives walk out into a blizzard is never a simple emotional experience." I took a slow breath, letting his question settle in my mind. Was I okay? For my entire adult life, my emotional state had been directly tethered to the financial demands of the people who had just walked out that door. I was always waiting for the next emergency phone call, the next massive credit card bill, the next cruel insult masked as a family joke. I was exhausted from playing the villain while secretly funding their luxurious fairy tale. I turned away from the front door and walked slowly back toward the dining room. Miles followed quietly behind me, giving me the space I needed. I stepped over the threshold and stood at the head of the long mahogany table. The room was a disaster zone of shattered illusions. Crystal champagne flutes lay tipped over on the white linen tablecloth, the expensive alcohol having soaked into the fabric like a dark stain. The heavy dining chairs were pushed back, haphazardly abandoned by the wealthy neighbors who had fled the felony arrests. Right in the center of the table, sitting in a pool of spilled brown gravy, was the stack of highlighted bank statements proving my sister and her husband had stolen from our grandfather. Next to it was the untouched, perfectly roasted Thanksgiving turkey. It was surrounded by imported floral centerpieces and expensive silver cutlery. It looked like a still-life painting of a ruined empire. Every single item in this room was purchased with money they did not have to impress people who did not actually care about them. I placed my hands on the back of Gordon's abandoned chair. I closed my eyes and took a very deep, slow breath. I let the air fill my lungs completely, and then I slowly exhaled. As the air left my body, I realized something incredible. The crushing weight that had been pressing down on my chest for over a decade was completely gone. The constant anxiety, the bitter resentment, the desperate need to buy their conditional love, it had all evaporated. For the first time in my entire life, standing in the ruins of their fake high society dinner party, I felt incredibly light. I was untethered. I was finally completely free from their toxic orbit. Miles walked up to the edge of the table, looking down at the massive, elaborate feast. "Well," he said, gesturing toward the silver platters of gourmet food, "the property is legally yours. The assets are secured. The hostile occupants have been successfully removed from the premises. I suppose the only thing left to figure out is what you want to do with all this food. It seems like a terrible waste to just throw out a perfectly good Thanksgiving dinner." I opened my eyes and looked at the lavish turkey, the truffles, the expensive imported cheeses, and the perfectly glazed vegetables. It was the food of people who cared more about appearances than actual nourishment. It was the exact meal Beatrice had planned to celebrate my absence. I felt my stomach rumble slightly, reminding me that I had not eaten since breakfast. I looked at Miles and shook my head. "I am not eating that," I said, my voice ringing clearly in the quiet room. "It tastes like lies and debt." I reached into my blazer pocket and pulled out my smartphone. I opened a delivery app, my thumb scrolling quickly past the expensive local bistros. "I am ordering a massive pepperoni pizza with extra cheese directly to the front gates of this mansion." Miles let out a rare, genuine laugh that echoed warmly in the quiet dining room. He buttoned his thick charcoal overcoat and picked up his leather briefcase. "You have definitely earned that pizza, Cassidy," he said with a respectful nod. "I will file the final registry paperwork with the county clerk first thing on Monday morning. Enjoy your peace and quiet. Have a happy Thanksgiving." I walked him to the front door, thanking him for executing the flawless legal strategy. After he drove away into the snowy night, my hot pizza arrived. I sat on the polished marble floor of the foyer, leaning against the heavy oak front door, and ate 3 slices of greasy, delicious pepperoni pizza. It was the best meal I had consumed in years. But as I walked back into the dining room to grab a napkin, I stared at the massive mahogany table. The extravagant holiday feast my mother had prepared to impress her wealthy country club friends was still sitting there. A massive 20-pound roasted turkey with a perfectly crisp golden skin. Huge silver bowls filled with garlic truffle mashed potatoes, roasted Brussels sprouts with crispy pancetta, and sweet potato casserole topped with toasted pecans. There were crystal platters of artisanal cheeses, imported crackers, and 3 elaborate pies from a luxury bakery in Manhattan. It was thousands of dollars worth of gourmet food completely untouched. I absolutely refused to eat a single bite of it, but throwing it away felt like a terrible sin. I walked into the massive chef's kitchen and began rummaging through the deep pantry cabinets. I found dozens of heavy-duty catering containers and aluminum trays left over from my parents' previous extravagant parties. I carried them into the dining room and started packing. I worked methodically, transferring the massive turkey, scraping the expensive side dishes into the aluminum pans, and carefully wrapping the untouched pies. I loaded my arms with the heavy containers and walked back and forth to my SUV parked in the garage. It took me nearly 40 minutes to pack up the entire feast, along with a crate of unopened sparkling apple cider. I pulled my car out of the warm garage and navigated the icy snow-covered roads of Fairfield County. I drove away from the wealthy, secluded estates of Greenwich and headed straight toward downtown Bridgeport. The streets were quiet and covered in a fresh blanket of white snow. I pulled up to a brick building I had researched years ago when I first started my financial consulting firm. It was a local women's shelter that provided emergency housing and support for women escaping domestic abuse and severe financial manipulation. I parked near the side entrance, popped my trunk, and walked up to the heavy metal security door. When I buzzed the intercom and explained what I had in my car, the shelter director immediately rushed out to help me. Her name was Brenda, a kind woman with tired but incredibly warm eyes. We carried the heavy aluminum trays into the shelter's brightly lit communal cafeteria. The women staying there had already finished a modest holiday meal, but when Brenda pulled the foil off the massive roasted turkey and the truffle mashed potatoes, the room completely transformed. Women and children gathered around the serving tables, their eyes wide with genuine shock and delight. I spent the next 3 hours standing behind that cafeteria line, serving hot plates of gourmet food to people who actually needed it. I handed out thick slices of turkey, scooped generous portions of sweet potato casserole, and cut the expensive Manhattan bakery pies into large pieces. The children laughed as they drank the sparkling cider from paper cups. The women thanked me repeatedly, their voices thick with sincere gratitude. Nobody asked me for money, nobody insulted my career, nobody judged my clothes or told me I was ruining their aesthetic. They just looked at me with pure, unadulterated appreciation. Later that evening, I sat at a long plastic folding table next to a young mother who had escaped a terrible financial abuse situation. We shared a slice of warm pumpkin pie on a paper plate. We did not share the same blood, and we did not share the same background, but we shared a mutual understanding of survival. I looked around the cafeteria, listening to the warm chatter and the innocent laughter of the children. It was the complete opposite of the tense, toxic, performative dinner parties my parents hosted. I took a deep breath, feeling completely at home in a room full of strangers. I finally realized the ultimate truth that my parents had tried to hide from me for my entire life. I realized that family is not blood. Family is simply the people who treat you with basic human respect. A month passed since that freezing Thanksgiving night. December arrived in New York and Connecticut, bringing heavy snow and the relentless cheer of the holiday season. For the first time in my 33 years of existence, the holidays did not fill me with crippling anxiety. I was not maxing out my credit cards to buy expensive gifts for people who despised me. I was not bracing myself for cruel comments about my career or my relationship status. I was simply living my life in Manhattan, focused on my firm and my own peace of mind. But while my life was moving forward, the people who used to call me family were experiencing a brutal crash course in reality. The transition from a multi-million-dollar Greenwich estate to the absolute bottom of the socio-economic ladder was neither slow nor forgiving. Beatrice and Gordon were currently living in a cramped, drafty one-bedroom apartment on the industrial outskirts of New Haven. There were no crystal chandeliers or imported marble floors in their new reality. They had stained carpet-peeling paint and a landlord who demanded rent in certified cashier checks because their credit scores were completely ruined. The wealthy country club friends they had spent decades trying to impress had entirely blacklisted them. When your son-in-law is indicted for federal wire fraud and your house is foreclosed on by your own daughter, high society doors lock instantly. With their bank accounts frozen and their retirement funds seized to satisfy the remaining debts, Gordon was forced to do something he had not done in 30 years. He had to get a working-class job. The former banking executive who used to mock my financial spreadsheets was now working as a front-door greeter at a massive chain hardware store. He spent 8 hours a day standing on a hard concrete floor wearing a cheap nylon vest over his faded shirts. He handed out sales flyers and directed contractors to the plumbing aisles. I heard through the legal grapevine that he developed terrible back pain within the first week, but he could not afford to quit. If he missed a shift, they could not pay their utility bills. Beatrice, who had never worked a day in her life, spent her days sitting in that tiny apartment staring at the walls, completely paralyzed by the loss of her social status. Melanie had it even worse. When the news of Jordan's arrest hit the local papers, it did not take long for her carefully curated internet persona to completely implode. Her followers discovered that the luxury cars, the designer clothes, and the lavish vacations were all funded by stolen trust money and fraudulent loans. The backlash was swift and merciless. Her brand sponsors dropped her within 48 hours. Her influencer career was dead buried under an avalanche of public humiliation. Stripped of her fake wealth, Melanie was forced to move into the tiny living room of our parents' apartment. She was currently working a minimum-wage retail job at a discount clothing store in a dying shopping mall. The girl who used to charter private jets to Milan was now spending her weekends folding clearance sweaters and dealing with angry bargain hunters. As for Jordan, his arrogant legal maneuvers could not save him. He was sitting in a 6-by-8-foot cell in the county detention center, denied bail because he was deemed a flight risk due to his financial crimes. He was awaiting a federal trial that would inevitably end with a lengthy prison sentence and the permanent loss of his law license. Their empire of lies had burned to the ground, and I did not feel a single ounce of guilt. I was sitting at my desk in my Manhattan office on a Tuesday afternoon when my assistant walked in holding a small stack of mail. She placed a familiar-looking red envelope right on top of my keyboard. I recognized the neat, looping handwriting immediately. It was from Beatrice. It was a Christmas card. I stared at the envelope for a long time. I knew exactly what was inside, without even opening it. It would be a desperate plea disguised as holiday cheer, a tear-stained apology manufactured to manipulate my emotions, a request for financial mercy wrapped in festive red paper. They thought the spirit of the season would make me soft. They thought a month of suffering was enough to erase a lifetime of abuse. I picked up a thick black marker from my desk cup. I did not open the envelope. I did not read their desperate words. I simply drew a thick black line through my address and wrote "Return to sender" in bold capital letters. I handed it right back to her. That red envelope was the final lingering shadow of my past, and dismissing it felt like exhaling a breath I had been holding for decades. But while my mind and my daily life in Manhattan were finally free, my financial portfolio was still anchoring me to the source of my trauma. The massive colonial estate in Greenwich was officially and legally mine, sitting empty and cold under the Connecticut snow. Miles had successfully filed all the deeds and transfer paperwork. I held the pristine title to a multi-million-dollar property. Some people asked me if I planned to move in, assuming I would want to claim my childhood home as the ultimate trophy of my victory. They did not understand the reality of that house. I absolutely refused to live there. The estate was not a trophy. It was a mausoleum of bad memories tainted by years of emotional neglect, screaming matches, and suffocating expectations. Walking through those grand hallways would only remind me of the wobbly folding table in the corner of the dining room. Sleeping in the master suite would only remind me of Beatrice stuffing stolen diamonds into a garbage bag. I did not want to breathe the air inside those walls ever again. I wanted the house gone, and I wanted it stripped to the bone before I handed over the keys. I did not want a single trace of Gordon or Beatrice left behind. The following Monday, I hired the most aggressive high-end estate liquidation firm in the tri-state area. I gave them a very simple directive. I told them to sell absolutely everything that was not permanently bolted to the foundation. I did not oversee the process personally. I stayed in my Manhattan office and let the professionals dismantle the fake legacy my parents had built. For 3 straight days, a small army of appraisers and auctioneers swarmed the Greenwich property. They dragged their heavy boots across the pristine marble floors of the foyer. They slapped neon price tags on the heavy mahogany dining table where my sister had mocked me. They auctioned off the crystal champagne flutes Beatrice had used to toast my absence. They cataloged the imported floral centerpieces, the oil paintings, the designer furniture, and the expensive silk bedspreads. Everything went to the highest bidder. The luxury goods my parents had gone into crippling debt to acquire were sold off for pennies on the dollar to bargain hunters and antique dealers. When the liquidation firm finished, they sent me a video walkthrough of the property. The house was completely unrecognizable. Without the expensive Persian rugs, the towering bookshelves, and the curated art, the massive estate just looked hollow. It looked empty, echoing, and entirely devoid of a soul. It looked exactly like the family that used to live inside it. The liquidation sale alone brought in enough cash to cover a significant portion of the initial debt, but the real prize was the property itself. I immediately hired a ruthless commercial real estate broker. I instructed him to price the property aggressively for a quick, uncompromising sale. I did not want to wait around for sentimental families looking for their forever home. I wanted a cash buyer who understood the raw value of the land in Fairfield County. The market was highly competitive, and a pristine colonial estate in that zip code was a rare commodity. Within 2 weeks, we had a fierce bidding war. We closed the sale just a few days after the new year. The buyer was a nameless corporate entity, looking to raise the house and subdivide the massive plot of land into 3 smaller luxury lots. I signed the final transfer documents in Miles' office, sipping a cup of hot black coffee. I did not feel a single ounce of nostalgia as I legally signed away my childhood home to be demolished by bulldozers. The sale finalized, and the funds were immediately wired directly into the primary operating account of Apex Holdings. It was a staggering amount of money. Even after paying off the remainder of the commercial loan I had purchased, the sheer profit from the home equity was massive. It was a multi-million-dollar windfall. For a brief moment, I sat at my desk and stared at the glowing numbers on my computer screen. A typical financial consultant would instantly reinvest those funds into a diversified portfolio of index funds, high-yield municipal bonds, or perhaps another piece of lucrative commercial real estate. That would be the logical expected strategy. But as I looked at the massive balance, I knew I could not treat this money like standard corporate profit. This wealth was extracted directly from the toxic roots of my family tree. It was the physical manifestation of my survival. Letting it sit in a sterile bank account accumulating standard interest felt entirely wrong. I did not want to simply hoard the wealth my parents had killed themselves trying to project. I had a much more specific, highly poetic plan for this money. A plan that would permanently rewrite the legacy of my grandfather and ensure my parents were erased from it forever. I picked up my office phone and dialed Miles. I bypassed the standard corporate pleasantries and told him to start drafting the articles of incorporation for a new philanthropic entity. I wanted an irrevocable charitable trust fully funded by the massive capital generated from the sale of the Greenwich estate. But the financial structure was merely the mechanism. The mission statement was the beating heart of the project. I instructed Miles to create a comprehensive grant and scholarship program exclusively dedicated to young women who had survived financial abuse, parental abandonment, or coercive economic control. I wanted to find the women who had been told they were burdens, the girls who were handed predatory federal loan applications while their parents secretly funded their siblings' luxury lifestyles. I wanted to reach the women whose credit scores had been hijacked and ruined by their own flesh and blood before they even turned 18. My parents had used money as a weapon to control, belittle, and isolate me. I was going to use their money as an impenetrable shield to protect others from that exact same fate. When Miles asked what name should go on the legal charter, the answer was instantaneous. The Theodore Educational Foundation, I told him. I was naming it directly after my late grandfather. Theodore was a brilliant, pragmatic man who had built his considerable wealth through decades of grueling hard work and smart investments, not through social climbing or aggressive credit card debt. He had established his family trust to ensure his descendants would never face poverty, only to have his own son ignore his wishes and his grandson-in-law embezzle the funds to pay for designer clothes and country club memberships. By anchoring this massive new foundation entirely to his name, I was completing the ultimate erasure. Gordon and Beatrice would never have a library, a hospital wing, or a charity attached to their memory. Their legacy was a ruined apartment, a towed Range Rover, and a string of bounced checks. Theodore's legacy would be the thousands of women who achieved complete financial independence. The legal paperwork moved with ruthless efficiency. Within 6 weeks, the foundation was officially registered and operational. We did not waste money on lavish gala dinners or expensive marketing campaigns to impress high society donors. I bypassed the Greenwich Country Club crowd entirely. Instead, I reached out directly to Brenda, the director of the women's shelter in downtown Bridgeport, where I had served the Thanksgiving feast. I made her facility the very first partner in our network. We did not just offer a few $100s for college textbooks. We provided total financial resurrections. We fully funded university tuitions, issued aggressive debt relief grants to pay off forced loans, and provided significant seed capital for women starting independent businesses. We built the exact safety net my father had gleefully ripped away from me when I was a teenager. Sitting at my massive mahogany desk, I personally reviewed the very first round of grant applications. I read thick files detailing horrific stories of economic sabotage. I read about husbands who hid assets and mothers who opened secret credit cards in their daughters' names. Reading their trauma did not break me. It fueled a cold, unstoppable resolve. I signed every single approval letter with a heavy gold pen. With every stroke of ink, I knew I was changing the entire trajectory of a human life. I was not just writing checks. I was handing them the precise weapon they needed to fight back and sever their own chains. I was giving them the ultimate luxury of freedom. The sheer dichotomy between my new reality and my family's absolute ruin was poetic. While Melanie was standing on her feet for 8 hours a day, folding discount sweaters at a dying retail mall, I was fully funding the medical school tuition of a young woman who had escaped a violently controlling household. While Gordon was standing on a concrete floor greeting hardware store customers just to keep his heating bill paid, I was managing a multi-million-dollar endowment that would outlast us all. And while Jordan was sitting in a cinder-block county jail cell, waiting for a judge to officially strip him of his law license, the women he and my sister had mocked and stolen from were finally getting the justice they deserved. The universe had forcefully course-corrected, and I was the one who had grabbed the steering wheel. I closed the final leather-bound acceptance folder and placed it neatly on the corner of my desk. I pushed my heavy chair back and stood up. The office was quiet, insulated from the blaring horns and sirens of the streets below. I walked slowly over to the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of my corner office. The late afternoon sun was beginning to set over Manhattan, casting a brilliant, blinding golden glow across the towering glass skyscrapers. The city stretched out before me, a chaotic, beautiful maze of ambition, greed, and millions of people fighting for their own survival. For so many long, agonizing years, I had been forced to navigate that maze with a heavy iron chain wrapped tightly around my ankle, constantly dragged backward by the toxic demands and manufactured crises of my family. I placed my hand flat against the cool, thick glass of the window. The chain was finally broken. The weight was entirely gone. I took a deep, clear breath, feeling the quiet, powerful hum of the city vibrating through the glass beneath my palm. I looked out over the sprawling, endless skyline. I was completely untouchable. I was utterly free. Society has a terrible habit of telling us that blood is thicker than water. We are relentlessly conditioned to believe that family is an unbreakable bond, a sacred contract that must be honored regardless of the cost to our own mental health or financial stability. We are told to forgive the unforgivable simply because we share DNA. But society lies. The water of a chosen family and a carefully protected life is infinitely sweeter than the toxic blood of people who view you as nothing more than a personal ATM. When a stranger steals from you, it is called a felony. When a stranger manipulates you, it is called abuse. But when a parent or a sibling does those exact same things, we are pressured to call it family drama. We are expected to swallow our pride, write another check, and show up for the holiday dinner with a smile. I stopped smiling a long time ago. Breaking free from that generational brainwashing was the hardest thing I ever had to do, but it was also the most necessary. The absolute hardest part of surviving financial abuse is recognizing it for what it truly is. It hides behind beautifully printed holiday cards and country club memberships. It masks itself as parental expectations, sibling rivalry, or temporary bad luck. You convince yourself that if you just pay off one more credit card, if you just cover one more mortgage payment, they will finally see your worth. You think you are buying their love and securing your place at the head of the table. But the reality is far more brutal. You cannot buy respect from people who fundamentally do not respect you. You are simply funding your own disrespect. The moment I stopped playing their rigged game, the entire power dynamic shifted. I realized that when you are the one quietly funding the grand illusion, you are also the only one who holds the absolute power to shatter it. For years, my family mistook my silence for submission. They mistook my financial support for a desperate, pathetic need to belong. They thought I was weak because I chose to retreat to my corporate spreadsheets instead of screaming at them in the hallways. They thought my patience was cowardice. But I was not hiding. I was building. I was quietly stacking my resources, securing my assets, and constructing an impenetrable fortress of independence. I was ensuring that when I finally dropped the match on their house of cards, I was standing safely outside the blast radius holding the deed to the property. I look back on that snowy Thanksgiving night, not with a lingering sense of anger, but with absolute crystalline clarity. I picture my mother, my father, my sister, and my arrogant brother-in-law sitting around that lavish mahogany table before I arrived. I picture them raising their expensive crystal champagne flutes, toasting to their fake wealth, and laughing at the empty chair where they thought I belonged. They celebrated my absence because they thought I was a victim. They didn't realize I was the architect of their consequences. This story is not just about a foreclosed Greenwich mansion, a stolen vintage watch, or a dramatic Thanksgiving dinner. It is a blueprint for taking back your own power. I know there are so many of you out there who are currently sitting at your own versions of the children's table. You are biting your tongue to keep a peace that does not actually exist. You are signing checks you cannot afford, enduring passive-aggressive insults you do not deserve, and literally setting yourself on fire just to keep toxic people warm. It is time to extinguish that flame. It is time to stop subsidizing your own abuse. Walking away from family is a terrifying prospect, but staying in a room where your soul is being slowly drained is a guaranteed tragedy. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever had to cut toxic family members off to protect your peace and your assets? Let me know your stories in the comments. Share your victories, your struggles, and the hard boundaries you had to draw to save your own life. There is immense power in knowing you are not alone in this fight, and your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today to finally walk out their own front door. If you enjoyed this journey of taking back power, please hit like, subscribe, and remember, never let anyone make you feel small in a house you paid for.